You can hide scars under long sleeves and nightmares behind polite smiles, but you can never hide the eyes of someone who has stared down death. In a family that worships superficial wealth, my silence was mistaken for failure. They saw a timid clerk counting the days until retirement. When my cousin turned my past into a punchline for the elite, he awoke a monster the military dares not name. Sit down. This is pure judgment. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Paisley Hunt. The annual family gathering was always a meticulously curated spectacle of excess, a stage where everyone was required to perform their success. This year, the venue was a sprawling multi-million-dollar lakefront mansion perched on the edge of Lake Travis in Austin, Texas. The humid evening air was thick with the rich scent of slow-smoked barbecue brisket, the bitter tang of overpriced craft beer, and the exhausting, constant hum of relatives bragging about their latest stock portfolios. To my family, success was exclusively measured in square footage, luxury car leases, and venture capital funding. They thrived on superficial achievements, building their entire identities around how much wealth they could parade in front of one another. I stood silently near the edge of the extravagant stone patio, dressed in a simple pair of faded jeans and a plain black t-shirt, looking entirely out of place among the sea of designer linen shirts and silk sundresses. Holding court at the center of the manicured lawn was my 38-year-old cousin, Julian. He was the undisputed golden boy of the bloodline, the one everyone looked up to. Julian had recently struck gold as a tech entrepreneur, selling predictive tactical software to private military contractors. He carried himself with the fabricated swagger of a battle-hardened general, loudly debating geopolitical conflicts, weapon systems, and troop movements with absolute authority. The bitter irony was entirely lost on him that the closest he had ever come to an actual combat zone was playing virtual reality video games in his climate-controlled penthouse in Silicon Valley. Yet, he loved to sprinkle his daily vocabulary with stolen military jargon, casually throwing around terms like collateral damage, force multiplier, and kinetic action while sipping his artisanal gin and tonic. He was a man who wore the aesthetics of war as a high-end fashion statement, completely and utterly ignorant of the blood, sweat, and trauma it takes to actually earn them. As for me, the family had long ago decided exactly what box I fit into. To them, I was just poor, unambitious Paisley. They firmly believed I was nothing more than a mid-level administrative clerk, pushing paper and filing endless expense reports for an obscure, boring government agency called the Department of Asymmetric Oversight, or the DAO. They openly pitied my modest government salary. They thought my quiet demeanor and reluctance to talk about myself were clear symptoms of a lack of drive and a deeply uninteresting life. I let them think it. The illusion was comfortable. The illusion was incredibly safe. It kept them from prying, and more importantly, it kept them from asking questions I could never, ever answer. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the rippling lake in dark shades of bruised purple and crimson, we gathered around the massive, custom-built teakwood dining table. Naturally, Julian positioned himself at the very head of the table, ready to hold his captive audience. About halfway through the lavish meal, perhaps feeling the spotlight dimming slightly, and needing a fresh target to elevate his own self-importance, his gaze locked directly onto me. He leaned back in his expensive chair, arrogantly swishing the ice in his whiskey glass, and smirked. He began to systematically dissect my life for the entertainment of the table. He mockingly praised my supposed dedication to the air-conditioned, fluorescent-lit trenches of federal bureaucracy. He loudly and obnoxiously contrasted my quiet desk job with his recent high-stakes meetings at the Pentagon, boasting endlessly about how his proprietary algorithms were single-handedly shaping the future of global warfare. The rest of the family chuckled along obediently, sipping their imported wine, perfectly comfortable watching him use me as his personal footstool to reach a higher pedestal. Then came the absolute crescendo of his arrogance. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the table, his eyes gleaming with pure condescension. "Come on, Paisley," he said, his voice projecting loudly enough to silence all the surrounding chatter. "Be honest with us for a second. Have you ever actually shot anyone? Or do you just give nasty paper cuts to the bad guys?" I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I calmly picked up my heavy crystal water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it back down on the table with a soft, definitive clink. "Only those who got in Banshee's way," I replied. My tone was dead flat, completely devoid of any humor, anger, or defensive emotion. For a split second, the entire table erupted into laughter, assuming my dry response was a rare, self-deprecating attempt at a joke. But the laughter died an abrupt, unnatural death. From the far corner of the table, a violent, guttural sound shattered the relaxed atmosphere. It was the sound of a man choking, gasping desperately for air, as if his lungs had suddenly collapsed. Vance, a towering, heavily muscled former Navy SEAL who had been invited as an esteemed guest of Julian's father, lunged forward in his seat. The heavy glass tumbler he had been holding slipped straight through his trembling fingers, shattering into dozens of jagged pieces against the stone patio. His face had drained of all blood, turning a sickly ashen white. He sat entirely paralyzed, his wide, terrified eyes pinned directly on me, radiating a raw, undeniable mixture of absolute horror and profound reverence. The sudden shatter of crystal against stone should have been a wake-up call, a jarring break in the pristine bubble of the evening. Instead, the heavy silence that followed lasted only a handful of seconds. Julian, ever the conductor of his own reality, let out a booming laugh and slapped the heavy wooden table. He loudly announced that the old war hero had simply taken his imported whiskey a little too fast, commanding the catering staff to sweep up the mess and fetch a fresh glass. The rest of the family eagerly followed his lead, diving right back into their shallow debates about luxury vehicle leases and the skyrocketing housing market. They were desperate to ignore the raw, unscripted human moment that had just ruptured their perfectly curated dinner. I did not wait for the meaningless conversation to swallow me again. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping softly against the stone patio, and walked away from the blinding halogen lights of the dining area. I made my way down the gently sloping lawn toward the private wooden dock that stretched out into the black water of the lake. The night air down by the water was significantly cooler, carrying the faint, earthy scent of algae and wet timber. The distant, obnoxious chatter of my family faded into a dull, unintelligible hum, replaced by the rhythmic slapping of tiny waves against the thick wooden pilings. I stood at the very edge of the dock, staring out into the absolute darkness of the water, letting the shadows wash over me. It was a familiar comfort. The dark is where I have always done my best work. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the gravel path signaled that I was not alone. The wooden planks of the dock groaned slightly under a massive, shifting weight. I did not need to turn around to know it was Vance. The large man stopped exactly 2 paces behind me. For a man of his immense size and lethal training, his posture was entirely devoid of aggression. It was an ingrained instinct, a physical manifestation of absolute deference. "Are you the one who held the choke point in the Sonora Valley?" His voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the crushing weight of a collapsing building. It shook with an emotion so violently suppressed that it cracked the very edges of his words. He did not use my name. He did not ask for a formal introduction. He only asked about the valley. The name alone was a mental trigger, ripping away the tranquil facade of the Texas lake and dragging me instantly backward in time. 4 years ago. That was the last time I had felt the suffocating, dusty heat of Central America. It was supposed to be a standard extraction, a quick and silent operation coordinated through the shadows. But the intelligence briefing was fatally flawed. Vance and his elite team of Tier 1 operators had walked straight into an orchestrated meat grinder. A massive cartel faction, backed by highly trained paramilitary mercenaries, had laid a flawless ambush deep within the jagged, unyielding ravines of the Sonora Valley. I remembered the deafening roar of the rescue helicopter being blown out of the sky by a surface-to-air missile, scattering burning metal and aviation fuel across the rocky ridge. I remembered the sudden, terrifying silence that followed when the satellite communication grid was entirely jammed by a localized electromagnetic storm, severing all contact with the outside world. Command had officially declared the valley a lost cause. The final order had come down through my encrypted earpiece, cold and mechanical, demanding an immediate withdrawal of all remaining support assets. They were officially writing off the men bleeding out on the ground. I was positioned on a high, unstable ridge, exactly 2 miles away, looking down through the advanced thermal optics of my heavy sniper rifle. I watched the dust kick up as over 80 heavily armed hostiles closed in on the trapped American forces. I heard the frantic, blood-choked breathing of wounded men through the localized tactical radio frequency. I reached up, pressed the transmission button on my radio, and permanently severed my connection to command. I became a ghost. For 6 agonizing hours, I held that rocky high ground entirely alone. The brutal recoil of the heavy rifle bruised my shoulder down to the bone. The barrel burned my hands, warping the air above the steel with intense heat. I calculated wind speeds, bullet drop, and human panic, placing shot after perfect shot into the encroaching tree line, building a wall of invisible, lethal force around the pinned soldiers. I gave them the only thing they needed to survive. I gave them time. I gave them enough time to drag their bleeding brothers out of the kill zone and disappear into the dense jungle canopy under the relentless cover of my suppressing fire. I turned away from the black water of the lake and finally looked at Vance. The pale moonlight caught the silver streaks in his closely cropped hair and the jagged, faded scars running along his jawline. I did not say a single word. I simply held his gaze, allowing the shared, unspoken memory of that blood-soaked ravine to pass silently between us. The massive, battle-hardened veteran crumpled. His broad shoulders hitched, and thick, heavy tears spilled over his lower eyelids, tracking through the deep lines of his weathered face. He wept silently, the way only men who have seen the absolute worst of humanity know how to weep. He told me, his voice breaking with every syllable, that he and his surviving brothers had spent the last 4 years desperately searching for the guardian angel who had rained hellfire from the ridge. He explained that every single file, every mission report, and every shred of evidence regarding that day had been permanently sealed and buried under the highest possible top-secret classification. They were repeatedly told the operative simply did not exist. Now, standing on a damp dock in Texas, the ghost finally had a face. Neither of us noticed the shadow lurking near the edge of the manicured hedges. Julian had followed us down from the illuminated patio. Driven by his insatiable ego and a petty, burning jealousy over the fact that his esteemed guest of honor had abandoned his table to speak with the family disappointment, he had hidden himself in the dark to eavesdrop. From his concealed vantage point behind the foliage, he heard the hushed, trembling tones. He heard the tears falling onto the wooden planks. But Julian possessed a fundamentally hollow soul. He lacked the basic human capacity to comprehend genuine sacrifice, or the sacred, unbreakable bond forged in the fires of combat. Through his warped, narcissistic lens, he processed the entire solemn scene as a pathetic, manipulative theatrical performance. He convinced himself that I had somehow used my low-level government clearance to dig up rumors of Vance's classified history and fabricated a cheap, melodramatic script to manipulate an emotionally fragile old veteran. He saw it as a desperate, pathetic attempt by a lowly clerk to steal his spotlight and gain unearned sympathy from a wealthy man. As he slipped quietly back toward the glowing lights of the mansion, a cruel, arrogant smirk twisted his lips. He had made a firm, unshakable decision. He was going to expose my supposed lie, and he was going to publicly destroy me in front of the entire elite class of Austin. The glare of the morning sun bouncing off the lake did absolutely nothing to burn away the suffocating pretension lingering from the night before. We were all gathered in the expansive, marble-clad kitchen, picking at a catered breakfast spread that likely cost more than 2 months of my supposed government salary. Julian made his entrance with the practiced, insufferable theatricality of a man who believed the world revolved around his every breath. He did not just walk into the room, he commandeered it. Clapping his hands together loudly to demand absolute silence from the chatting relatives, he prepared to deliver his grand announcement. Tomorrow evening, he declared, he was hosting an ultra-exclusive black-tie gala at a prestigious 5-star hotel right in the beating heart of downtown Austin. The event was not merely a party, it was the highly anticipated red carpet launch of his flagship corporate project. He was unveiling a proprietary military tactical artificial intelligence software, a system he boldly claimed was valued at tens of millions of dollars. He spoke about warfare not as a tragic breakdown of human diplomacy, but as a highly profitable data set, an algorithm waiting to be optimized by his Silicon Valley brilliance. He paced the length of the massive quartz kitchen island, his eyes deliberately scanning the room before locking onto me like a predator spotting a wounded animal. His voice took on a sickly sweet, patronizing tone, carefully calibrated to sound generous while dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. "Paisley," he called out, making absolutely sure every single aunt, uncle, and cousin was hanging on his every word. "I have reserved a very special seat just for you at my VIP table. I think it is long past time for a humble desk clerk to broaden her horizons and see the sheer scale of high-tech modern warfare." He paused, letting the calculated insult hang heavily in the air like foul smoke. He wanted the contrast to be painfully obvious to everyone in the room. "Come out of the basement for one night," Julian continued, his lips curling into a mocking sneer. "I will even introduce you to some real heroes. You know, men who actually pull the trigger and make the hard calls, instead of just filing the endless paperwork and stamping forms." A dense, highly uncomfortable silence fell over the kitchen. My aunt, Julian's mother, quickly pulled me aside a few minutes later, her manicured fingers gripping my forearm with surprising strength. Her voice was a hushed, frantic whisper. She desperately advised me to politely decline the invitation, framing her utter cowardice as maternal concern. She warned me that Julian was setting a deliberate trap, that he would use the glittering, high-stakes backdrop of the tech elite to publicly humiliate me. In her eyes, putting me in the same room as billionaire defense contractors would only amplify the massive gap in our social and financial standing. The family was quietly terrified that my unremarkable, impoverished presence would somehow tarnish their collective brand. They wanted me to retreat, to hide in the shadows where they firmly believed I belonged. But they severely underestimated the depth of my vision. I looked right through Julian's transparent, fragile ego. I saw exactly the narrative he was trying to build. He desperately needed a foil, a dull, unpolished stone to make his artificial diamond shine just a little bit brighter. He fully intended to use my quiet, unassuming nature as a literal stepping stone to elevate his own fabricated greatness in front of his wealthy investors. He wanted to parade me around as the obsolete past while positioning himself as the brilliant future of global defense. I did not shrink away. I did not offer a meek, apologetic excuse to escape his snare. Instead, I stood my ground, looked him dead in the eye, and allowed a slow, chilling smile to curve the corners of my mouth. "I would not miss it for the world," I replied smoothly, my voice completely devoid of the intimidation he so desperately craved. Julian beamed, utterly drunk on his perceived victory. He believed he had successfully cornered the weakest member of the herd. He gave a dismissive wave and strutted out of the kitchen to make his endless string of important phone calls. As I turned around to pour myself a cup of black coffee, my gaze drifted past the massive sliding glass doors to the shaded corner of the outdoor stone terrace. Tucked away behind a large decorative pillar, partially obscured by the morning shadows, stood Vance. His broad back was turned to the house, but his posture was rigid with an electric, coiled tension that I recognized instantly. It was the stance of an operator preparing for a strike. He held a heavy, secure satellite phone tightly against his ear. The thick glass of the doors muffled his voice entirely, but my specialized training allowed me to read the sharp, precise movements of his lips with absolute clarity. "It is her," he whispered intensely into the receiver. "She has appeared. Get everyone to assemble in Austin." The grand ballroom of the five-star hotel in downtown Austin was a suffocating monument to corporate vanity. Crystal chandeliers roughly the size of small vehicles hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a blinding fractured light over a sea of tailored tuxedos and glittering evening gowns. Waiters in pristine white coats glided silently across the plush carpets, carrying silver trays loaded with glasses of vintage champagne that cost more per bottle than the monthly rent of an average family. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with the elite titans of the defense industry. There were venture capitalists looking for their next billion-dollar payout, aggressive private military contractors, and retired, high-ranking generals who had traded their worn combat boots for lucrative seats on corporate boards. It was an environment where the brutal, visceral reality of war was completely sterilized, repackaged, and sold as a clean, highly profitable commodity. The air was thick with the smell of expensive cologne, roasted duck, and unbridled greed. I arrived wearing a sharply tailored, minimalist black suit. I wore absolutely no jewelry, and my hair was pulled back into a severe, practical knot. Amidst the explosion of diamonds and silk, I looked like a shadow that had accidentally slipped into the room. That was entirely by Julian's design. As soon as I walked through the towering double doors, one of his overly enthusiastic event coordinators intercepted me and escorted me straight to the front of the room. Julian had intentionally placed me at the center table, directly flanked by his most important prospective investors and a few four-star generals. I was seated right in the blast zone of his ego, perfectly positioned for the theatrical performance he had been plotting since the lake house. The lights dimmed abruptly, plunging the room into darkness before a massive, high-definition screen illuminated the entire stage. Julian walked out to a wave of thunderous applause, holding a sleek wireless microphone. He looked like a televangelist selling salvation, except his god was artificial intelligence. He spent the first 20 minutes weaving a spell of pure technological arrogance. He confidently declared that human emotion was the absolute greatest liability on the modern battlefield. He claimed that fear, exhaustion, and adrenaline were obsolete glitches in a system that his proprietary software was about to permanently fix. He paced back and forth, gesturing wildly, promising these wealthy investors that if the military had adopted his system 10 years ago, countless historical tragedies and botched operations would never have happened. He spoke of human lives as if they were nothing more than data points on a spreadsheet, easily corrected by a superior algorithm. To truly understand the revolutionary power of this software, Julian announced, his voice echoing off the acoustic panels of the massive hall, we need to look at a real-world example of catastrophic human failure. He pressed a button on his remote. The giant screen behind him shifted, displaying a highly detailed, three-dimensional topographical map. It was a digital rendering of a deep, jagged valley system located somewhere in Central America. The computer graphics showed tiny blue dots representing American forces trapped at the bottom of a steep ravine, completely surrounded by a swarm of red dots signifying heavily armed hostile fighters. Julian dramatically lowered his voice, adopting a tone of fake sympathy. This was a classified engagement a few years ago. Our military leaders, relying on flawed human intuition, made a disastrous tactical error. They walked right into a kill zone. When the ambush hit, panic completely destroyed their command structure. They were trapped, bleeding out, and making entirely irrational decisions based on fear. He clicked the remote again. A bright green line suddenly traced a complex path up a steep, narrow ridge on the digital map. Our artificial intelligence ran the exact same variables, Julian boasted, his chest puffed out. And in less than 3 seconds, it calculated a flawless retreat path. It found the one single route out of the valley that the human commanders were entirely too terrified to see. If they had this technology, there would have been no panic, no heavy casualties, just a clean, algorithmic victory. He paused, letting the investors murmur their approval. Then, the inevitable happened. He could not resist the urge to twist the knife. He walked to the very edge of the stage, looked directly down at my table, and pointed his index finger right at my face. The spotlight followed his gesture, blinding me for a fraction of a second. Even a simple paper pusher like my cousin here understands this basic concept, Julian said, his voice dripping with loud public mockery. Humans always panic when the pressure is on. We make stupid, emotional decisions. That is precisely why she just stays home in an air-conditioned office, safely typing on a keyboard, leaving the real thinking to the machines. Polite, condescending laughter rippled through the wealthy crowd. The investors sitting next to me offered tight, pitying smiles. Julian stood on the stage, soaking in the adulation, entirely convinced he had just cemented his legacy by publicly humiliating me. I did not react to his insult. I did not care about the laughter. My eyes were completely locked onto the massive screen behind him. The artificial green line of his supposedly flawless computer algorithm burned into my retinas. The digital topography, the jagged rocks, the specific curvature of the narrow ridge where he claimed the trapped men should have retreated. My blood went completely cold. The ambient noise of the ballroom faded into a dull, distant ringing in my ears. The air in my lungs suddenly felt heavy, thick with the phantom taste of metallic dust and cordite. Julian had not just chosen a random simulation. In his desperate hunt for classified data to feed his machine, he had somehow gained access to the unredacted geographical coordinates of the Sonora Valley. He was standing on a brightly lit stage in a luxury hotel, arrogantly lecturing a room full of billionaires about cowardice and tactical failure, using the exact terrain where I had left a part of my soul. He was pointing at the exact ridge where I had bled. The polite, condescending laughter in the grand ballroom was still echoing off the crystal chandeliers when I pushed my chair back from the VIP table. The heavy wooden legs scraped against the polished marble floor, creating a sharp, discordant screech that sliced right through the smug atmosphere. I did not storm out in tears, as my family likely expected. I did not flush with anger or shout a defensive retort. I simply stood up. My face was a mask of absolute terrifying calm. I walked away from my seat, bypassing the bewildered stares of the 4-star generals and billionaire investors, and headed straight toward the sound technician's booth at the edge of the stage. The young man running the audio board froze as I approached. Without asking, I reached out and gently slid the spare wireless microphone from his trembling fingers. I turned and began walking up the carpeted steps to the main stage. Julian watched my ascent with a mixture of profound confusion and lingering amusement. He likely assumed I was coming up to make a fool of myself, perhaps to offer a pathetic, emotional defense of human nature. He stood his ground, crossing his arms over his tailored tuxedo, ready to enjoy the final act of my public humiliation. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from him. I did not look at my cousin. I turned my back to him entirely and faced the blinding spotlight, addressing the sea of wealthy investors and decorated military brass. "This software," I began, my voice ringing out through the massive speakers, smooth and lethally precise, is a beautifully designed coffin. A heavy, suffocating silence instantly crashed down upon the room. The clinking of champagne glasses stopped entirely. I turned slightly, pointing my free hand toward the massive digital map glowing behind us. The algorithm you are bidding millions of dollars on operates on a fundamental, fatal delusion. It assumes the battlefield is a sterile vacuum. It reads topographical data and calculates distance, but it is completely blind to the living, breathing chaos of the Earth. Julian's smug smile began to fracture. He took a step forward, his voice dropping to a frantic hiss, demanding I get off his stage. I ignored him completely. "Look at the green line," I commanded the audience, my voice projecting with the hardened authority of a combat officer. "The machine calculates that as the optimal retreat route because it has the shallowest incline. What the machine does not know is that at exactly 1400 hours, the thermal updraft funneling through that specific limestone gorge creates a violent wind shear. If a rescue helicopter tries to lower its cables there, the crosswind will snap the tail rotor against the cliff face in less than 5 seconds." Murmurs began to ripple through the front row of investors. A retired Marine Corps general sitting at my former table leaned forward, his eyes narrowing sharply as he studied the map. "Furthermore," I continued, pacing slowly across the stage, completely dominating the space, "the artificial intelligence calculates enemy pursuit based entirely on visual line of sight and standard patrol routes. It does not calculate the thick, humid jungle air. It does not account for the heavy, metallic stench of fresh arterial blood soaking into the dirt. The cartel fighters in that valley did not need to see the trapped men. They brought hunting dogs. The dogs smelled the copper and the fear. Your algorithm cannot code the smell of a bleeding soldier." Julian was sweating now. The stage light suddenly seemed entirely too hot for him. He reached for his own microphone, trying to interrupt, but his voice cracked. "And the most glaring failure of all," I stated, my tone dropping to a cold, razor-sharp edge. "The software assumes a functioning chain of command through satellite communications. It builds its entire tactical model on the premise that the soldiers can call for fire support. It completely ignores the localized, severe electromagnetic storm that rolled over that ridge, turning $200,000 encrypted radios into useless, dead plastic bricks. The machine expects orders. The reality was absolute, deafening silence." Julian completely snapped. The polished Silicon Valley visionary persona shattered into a million pieces. He lunged forward, desperately trying to physically snatch the microphone out of my hand. I sidestepped his clumsy grab with a fractional shift of my weight, leaving him stumbling off balance. He recovered, his face flushed an ugly mottled red. He gripped his own microphone and screamed, his voice echoing shrilly through the silent ballroom. "What do you know?" he yelled, his chest heaving, spittle flying from his lips. "This is highly classified, encrypted data. How does an administrative bitch like you know about wind speeds or magnetic storms in an unannounced top-secret operation?" The entire room held its collective breath. The tension was thick enough to choke on. I turned my head slowly and locked my eyes directly onto his. I let the silence stretch for 3 agonizing seconds, letting the immense weight of reality crush his artificial world. "I know," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of any theatricality, "because your artificial intelligence tells them to turn left. But the left pass that day was rigged with a daisy chain of anti-personnel mines that blew the terrain to hell." I took one step closer to him, invading his space, forcing him to look into the dead, unblinking eyes of someone who had actually lived his digital simulation. "I know," I whispered, though the microphone carried the chilling sound to the very back of the hall, "because I am the one who carried the commander through the right pass." The blood completely drained from Julian's face. His jaw went slack, and the expensive microphone slipped from his sweaty grip, hitting the stage floor with a deafening electronic squeal. Right at that exact second, before the feedback could even fade, a massive sound echoed from the back of the ballroom. The towering, heavy oak double doors of the hall were violently shoved open. They hit the walls with the force of a detonating breach charge. Vance stood in the doorway. He was no longer wearing the casual civilian clothes from the lake house. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, but he did not look like a businessman. He looked like a weapon, and he was not alone. Behind him, stepping out of the shadows of the corridor, were 6 other men. They were all dressed in identical dark suits. Some walked with a slight, permanent limp. Others bore thick, jagged burn scars across their necks and hands. Their faces were weathered, carved from years of violence and survival. They did not stroll into the room like party guests. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized fluidity. They entered in an invisible, overlapping tactical diamond formation, their eyes instinctively scanning the upper balconies and the exits, their bodies moving entirely out of ingrained muscle memory. They were apex predators, walking into a room full of soft, oblivious sheep. The ghosts of the Sonora Valley had finally arrived. The heavy, synchronized footfalls of the 6 veterans echoed like a steady drumbeat against the polished marble floor. They completely ignored the sea of terrified billionaires and bewildered tech moguls parting nervously to let them pass. They marched in a flawless, tight column straight toward the center of the stage where I stood. When they reached the bottom of the carpeted steps, they stopped as one unified entity. Heels clicked together with a sharp, cracking sound that cut through the dead silence of the ballroom. In perfect unison, 6 hardened warriors snapped their right hands to their brows, executing the highest, crispest military salute. It was not a courtesy gesture. It was a profound display of absolute reverence, a sacred acknowledgement between souls forged in the fires of an unnamed hell. The hundreds of elite investors, generals, and defense contractors sat paralyzed in their expensive chairs, utterly speechless. They were witnessing a level of raw, unfiltered honor that their checkbooks could never purchase. Vance did not stop at the bottom of the stairs. He walked heavily up onto the stage, his immense presence dwarfing my cousin. Julian was already trembling, his face a sickening shade of pale gray, staring at the ghosts he had tried to exploit. Vance bent down, scooped up the discarded microphone from the floor, and straightened up to face the crowd. "Your software is absolute garbage," Vance's voice thundered through the grand hall, raw and uncompromising. "It only reads dead data. It runs on numbers completely stripped of human sacrifice. But the person standing right in front of you, Operative Banshee, is the living, breathing reason that 7 of our lives are still standing on this earth today." He turned his cold, hard gaze directly onto Julian. "You took our blood. You took the graves of our brothers, and you turned it into a cheap parlor trick to sell your useless code. You are nothing but a parasite." Down in the center of the audience, the retired Marine Corps general who had been sitting at my table pushed his chair back. The heavy piece of furniture tipped over and crashed loudly onto the floor. The old commander stood at full attention, his face flushed with righteous, uncontrollable fury. He finally understood the sickening reality of the presentation. Julian had actively commodified a classified, catastrophic tragedy where real Marines and operators had been torn apart, all to secure venture capital. "I am pulling every single cent of my funding," the general roared, his voice carrying the distinct, terrifying boom of a man accustomed to commanding thousands. "My firm is withdrawing our $50 million pledge effective immediately. And I promise you this, boy, I will personally make sure that not a single defense contractor in this country ever takes a meeting with you again. You are entirely finished." The domino effect was instantaneous and brutal. Disgust rippled through the crowd. One by one, the other major investors and tech giants stood up, buttoned their suit jackets, and turned their backs on the stage. There was no hesitation. They were severing ties, pulling their massive investments right there on the spot. Julian's legs completely gave out. He collapsed onto his knees on the glossy stage floor, his tailored tuxedo wrinkling pathetically around him. In the span of 3 minutes, his entire empire of lies had burned to the ground. He had lost his pristine reputation, his company, and his tens of millions of dollars in backing. He was reduced to exactly what he truly was, the most pathetic, hollow imposter in the tech world, choking on the ashes of his own arrogance. Off to the side, seated near the exits, my family members were frozen in place. My aunt had her hands clamped firmly over her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and overwhelming shock. They stared at me, the quiet, poor administrative clerk they had spent decades mocking. The reality was finally crashing down upon them. The woman they had relentlessly pitied and despised was a silent giant, a protector who had stood in the darkest, most violent shadows to shield the very country that allowed them to live their comfortable, superficial lives. I did not offer them a second glance. I had no desire for their apologies or their sudden fabricated respect. My duty was never to them. I turned away from the trembling wreck of my cousin and walked calmly down the stage steps. Vance and his men fell into step right behind me, forming an impenetrable wall of living armor at my back. Together we walked down the center aisle, leaving the chaotic, suffocating vanity of high society far behind us. We pushed through the heavy glass doors of the hotel and stepped out into the cool, humid Texas night. The blinding flashbulbs and the suffocating scent of expensive cologne were replaced by the quiet hum of the city streets and the smell of impending rain. The old soldiers were waiting for me, offering quiet nods of profound understanding. We were going to find a dark, quiet bar to share a cold beer of absolute truth. We were going to a place where no one ever needed to raise their voice or flash a bank account to prove exactly who they were. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Vivian Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.